Someone interrupts you mid-sentence for the third time this meeting. A relative makes a joke at your expense in front of the whole table, and everyone laughs, including you, because what else are you supposed to do? A friend brushes off your feelings like they're an inconvenience. Somewhere along the way, you've absorbed the idea that respect is something you have to earn over and over, and that reacting calmly to being treated badly means smiling through it and letting it go. It doesn't. There's a difference between staying calm and staying silent about your own worth, and most people were never taught where that line actually sits. Over the next 29 minutes, I'm going to walk through 5 specific ways to handle disrespect. Ways that don't require raising your voice, starting a scene, or losing an ounce of your own composure, and that actually work better than confrontation does. Number 4 is the one people resist the most because it looks, from the outside, almost too simple to be a real solution. Stay with me, because by the end you'll have language for a boundary you've probably been struggling to set for years. These aren't tricks. They're closer to a discipline, the kind the Stoics spent their entire philosophy building, because they understood something most modern advice skips over. You can't control what someone else does to you. You can only ever control what you do in response. That single distinction is the foundation everything below is built on. 1. The silent stare. There's a specific kind of person who treats every gathering like an audition for the role of the one who says what everyone else is thinking, except what they're actually doing is testing how much they can get away with, one small dig at a time. I sat across from someone exactly like that at a wedding a couple of years ago, someone I barely knew, who spent an entire dinner making comments about other guests dressed up as observations, each one a little sharper than the last. Eventually, it turned toward me, a comment about my career that was engineered to sound like a joke while landing like a verdict. My instinct, in the half-second before I actually responded, was to defend myself, to explain the context he clearly didn't have, to correct the record. Instead, I just looked at him. Not glaring, not performing outrage, just a level, unhurried gaze, the kind you'd give someone if you were mildly curious what they'd say next. He laughed again, weaker this time, glanced at the people next to him for backup that didn't come, and quietly changed the subject. He didn't bring anything like that up again for the rest of the night. What actually happened in that exchange is worth slowing down on, because it explains why the silent stare works far more often than arguing does. People who provoke others are usually fishing for a specific reaction, visible discomfort, a flustered defense, an argument they can then frame themselves as merely responding to. The moment you decline to supply that reaction, the whole interaction stops making sense to them. They came prepared for a fight or a flinch. A calm, steady gaze is neither, and it leaves them holding their own comment with nowhere to put it. This tracks closely with something Marcus Aurelius kept returning to in his private writing. Other people's behavior is not something within your control, but your own response absolutely is. And that response is the only place your actual power ever lived in the first place. The silent stare is that principle made physical, a way of visibly declining to hand someone the reaction they came looking for, without needing to say a single word to make the refusal clear. There's a version of this that shows up constantly in professional settings, worth naming because it's less dramatic than a wedding, but arguably more useful day to day. Think about a colleague who makes a habit of talking over you in meetings, testing each time whether you'll let it slide. The instinct is often to talk faster, louder, to fight for the airtime back. A quieter and often more effective move is simply to stop mid-sentence the moment you're cut off, look at the person directly, and wait, visibly, unhurriedly, until the room's attention naturally redirects back to you. It rarely takes more than a few seconds, and it tends to work precisely because it denies the interrupter the thing they were actually testing for, whether you'd compete for the space or just quietly hand it over. None of this is about intimidation, and it's worth being honest about the distinction, because a stare weaponized to humiliate someone is just aggression wearing a calmer face. The version that actually works is the one grounded in genuine indifference to the outcome. You're not trying to win a silent contest. You're simply declining to participate in the one the other person started. That distinction is invisible from the outside, but very real on the inside, and people can usually tell the difference between someone performing calm and someone who's actually found it. 2. Silence as your answer. There's a particular kind of person who hides insults inside jokes, specifically so that objecting to them makes you look like you can't take a joke, a trap built into the delivery itself. I had a friend for a few years who operated almost entirely this way, always with a comment that landed a little too close to something real, always followed immediately by, "I'm just kidding," before you'd even had a chance to react. For a long time my move was to laugh along, or occasionally push back with a joke of my own, which he'd always top with something sharper. Neither approach actually worked, because both kept the exchange running on his terms. What changed things was doing almost nothing. The next time he made one of those comments, I just raised an eyebrow, said nothing, and let the silence sit there uncomfortably long enough that he had to fill it himself. He fumbled, mumbled something, and moved the conversation elsewhere. Over the following months, without either of us ever naming what had happened, he mostly stopped doing it around me specifically. He'd apparently recalibrated, somewhere below the surface, that this particular joke didn't land the way it used to and wasn't worth the awkward silence it now produced. What's worth understanding here is that people who disrespect others under the cover of humor are usually relying on your participation to make the joke function at all. A joke that gets no reaction, positive or defensive, simply fails as a joke, and failing repeatedly tends to train the behavior out far more effectively than confrontation does. Confrontation gives the comment weight. Silence starves it. Seneca wrote at length about the cost of letting other people's provocations rent space in your head, arguing that a disturbed mind hands its peace over willingly to whoever is loudest in the moment. The practical version of that idea is almost mechanical. Every time you respond, defensively, angrily, even just visibly rattled, you're handing the other person a small transaction of your attention, and attention, spent repeatedly on people who don't deserve it, is one of the more finite resources most people manage worse than their actual money. There's a modern life version of this worth naming specifically, because it's become so common it barely registers as a choice anymore. The reflex to respond immediately to a passive-aggressive text or comment on social media. Someone leaves a backhanded remark in a group chat, and the instinct is to fire something back within minutes, sometimes seconds, as if leaving it unanswered would somehow concede the point. In practice, the opposite is usually true. A message left unanswered, deliberately rather than out of avoidance, often lands with far more weight than any reply could, because it signals that the comment simply wasn't worth a reaction in the first place, and that reads, correctly, as a kind of quiet confidence the responder rarely has. 3. Stop explaining your choices. At some point, almost everyone runs into the specific social pressure of being expected to justify a decision that was never anyone else's to weigh in on. A career change, ending a relationship, moving somewhere unexpected, simply not attending an event people assumed you'd be at. I watched a cousin go through a compressed version of this after she left a stable, well-paying corporate job to retrain in something completely unrelated, with no guaranteed outcome waiting on the other side. For months, every family gathering came with some version of the same question. delivered with varying degrees of concern or thinly veiled judgment. Are you sure about this? Her first instinct was to over-explain, laying out the 5-year plan, the financial cushion, the research she'd done, hoping a sufficiently detailed answer would finally satisfy everyone and end the questioning. It never did. Each explanation just generated a new round of follow-up concerns, because the questions were never really about information in the first place. Eventually, she changed her answer entirely. Asked why, she'd simply say, "Because it's what I want to do," and stop there. No elaboration, no defense, no invitation to debate. It felt, by her own account, uncomfortable the first few times, almost rude, like she was withholding something people were owed. What she noticed instead was that the follow-up questions largely stopped, because there was nothing left in her answer to argue with. An unexplained decision, delivered calmly, is oddly harder to challenge than a heavily justified one, because justification implicitly invites debate over its merits, while a flat statement of preference simply doesn't. The deeper mechanism worth naming here: when someone pushes hard for an explanation of a decision that doesn't actually affect them, the pressure is rarely about genuine curiosity. More often, it's about managing their own discomfort. Your choice implicitly raises the question of why they haven't made a similar one, and getting you to justify yourself in enough detail lets them locate the specific flaw in your plan that reassures them their own choice was the safer one all along. Epictetus drew a sharp, useful line between what's within a person's control and what isn't, and your own decisions sit firmly in the first category, while other people's opinions of those decisions sit entirely in the second. Spending energy trying to manage the second category is, by that framing, a category error. Effort poured into something that was never actually available to you to control in the first place, at the direct expense of the one thing that was. How confidently and clearly you carry your own choice. There's a workplace version of this worth mentioning, since it's less personal but equally common. An employee who declines a promotion opportunity or leaves a high-status role for something quieter often gets pressed by colleagues for an explanation in a tone that implies something must be wrong with the decision. A short, calm answer, "It's not the right fit for me right now," tends to close that conversation far faster than a detailed justification does, precisely because it doesn't hand the questioner any material to keep probing. 4. Keep your distance. Of all 5, this is the one people resist longest, because it usually involves someone you're not supposed to want distance from: a family member, an old friend, someone with a legitimate claim on your life by virtue of history alone. That history is exactly what makes the pattern so hard to see clearly while you're inside it. I had a friendship for years with someone who never missed an opportunity to comment on my choices, my job, my relationships, even, at one particularly memorable dinner, my taste in music, delivered as a joke that wasn't quite a joke. For a long time I told myself this was just her personality, that I was being oversensitive, that good friends were supposed to tolerate a little friction. So I kept showing up, kept absorbing the comments, kept telling myself it wasn't a big enough deal to address directly. What I didn't notice, because it happened slowly, was how much low-level bracing I'd started doing before every interaction with her, a kind of preemptive tension, waiting to see what she'd say this time. The shift wasn't dramatic. I didn't confront her or end the friendship outright. I just started seeing her less, once a month instead of every week, declining a few invitations without much explanation, letting the natural rhythm of contact slow down. The clarity that showed up in that space was almost immediate. Once the friendship wasn't filling as much of my week, I could actually see how much of our contact had been built around her criticism rather than despite it, something that had been nearly invisible while we were seeing each other constantly. There's a real psychological cost to keeping someone close specifically because you feel obligated to, rather than because the relationship is actually good for you. And it's worth naming plainly. Proximity to someone who consistently disrespects you isn't neutral. It's an ongoing withdrawal from whatever reserve of confidence and peace you're otherwise building, made continuously, in small enough amounts that you rarely notice the balance dropping until it's already fairly depleted. Marcus Aurelius wrote about deliberately limiting his exposure to people whose habits and values he didn't want absorbing into his own, not out of contempt for them, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that who you spend time with shapes you whether you notice it happening or not. That's not an argument for cutting people off dramatically or treating distance as punishment. It's closer to triage, recognizing that your time and attention are finite, and that giving disproportionate access to someone who consistently uses that access to diminish you is a choice, even when it doesn't feel like one because they're family or we've known each other forever. There's a specific guilt that tends to show up here, worth addressing directly rather than glossing over. The sense that creating distance from someone makes you the difficult one, the disloyal one, the one who couldn't just let it go. That guilt is real, and it doesn't disqualify the choice. It's simply the emotional cost of doing something that runs against a social script most people were raised on. One that equates endurance with virtue regardless of what's actually being endured. Protecting your own peace isn't a betrayal of the relationship. It's usually the only version of the relationship that was ever going to be sustainable in the first place. 5. Hold your head high. This one sounds, on the surface, like the kind of advice you'd find on a motivational poster, vague, encouraging, not especially actionable. It becomes considerably more concrete once you understand what it's actually counteracting. I dealt for a stretch of time with someone who seemed to genuinely enjoy landing small digs at my expense whenever we crossed paths, always delivered with a smirk, always just plausible enough as a joke that objecting to it would have made me look thin-skinned. For a while, my response was to physically shrink around him without quite realizing I was doing it, avoiding eye contact, laughing along faster than the joke deserved, generally trying to get through the interaction with as little friction as possible. None of it made the comment stop. If anything, the visible discomfort seemed to invite more of them. What actually changed things wasn't a clever comeback. It was posture, almost literally. Walking in with my shoulders back, meeting his comments with a level look and a small, unbothered smile instead of a flinch, and continuing the conversation as though nothing notable had happened. The comments didn't stop instantly, but they thinned out noticeably within a few encounters, because the entire appeal of that kind of comment depends on a visible reaction it's fishing for. Once that reaction stopped showing up, the behavior lost most of its point. There's a real psychological mechanism underneath this, worth naming directly rather than treating it as pure metaphor. Physical posture and internal state run in both directions, not just one. Standing differently doesn't just broadcast confidence outward. It measurably shifts how you experience the interaction internally too, which is part of why fake it till you make it holds up better as advice than it sounds like it should. The visible confidence isn't just a performance for the other person's benefit. It's doing real work on your own nervous system in the moment, whether or not you fully feel it yet when you first try it. The Stoics treated self-respect as something you assign yourself rather than something you wait to receive as a verdict from other people, and that framing matters enormously here. Someone who disrespects you is, in a real sense, betting on your own uncertainty about your worth, testing whether you'll supply the self-doubt they're implying or decline to. Holding your head high, in that light, isn't really performance for an audience. It's a way of visibly declining to accept someone else's assessment of you as the correct one, which is a decision available to you regardless of what they actually think, and regardless of whether they ever change their behavior at all. Run back through all 5, and none of them require you to raise your voice, win an argument, or convince anyone of anything. The silent stare, choosing silence over reaction, declining to explain yourself, creating distance where it's earned, and simply carrying yourself like someone who already knows their own worth. All 5 are versions of the same underlying move, refusing to hand someone else the reaction, the explanation, the access, or the self-doubt they came looking for. None of it will change everyone. Some people will never treat you the way you deserve to be treated, no matter how calmly or clearly you hold your ground, and that's a fact worth accepting rather than fighting. What these 5 approaches actually protect isn't the other person's opinion of you. It's your own peace, which was always the only thing genuinely within your control in the first place. Life is too short to keep bending yourself into a shape that satisfies people who were never going to be satisfied. Stand where you are. That's usually enough.